workshop. So if you are if you're working on the FBI's payroll today and looking for the CSPEF people, you're in the wrong workshop. They're in the Central American workshop. I'm going to be your moderator. It's not often that I get cast in the role as the moderate, so I will enjoy that today. Sitting to my left are three panelists. Jacqueline Sharkey, who is going to speak first. Jacqueline is a journalism professor at the University of Arizona at Tucson. Those are the Sun Devils?
No.
The Wildcats.
Right.
Excuse me. So Sun Devils is Arizona State. And Jacqueline won the Sidney Hillman Foundation award that's actually given by the International Lady Garment Workers Union for the American, the IGLW or AC? No, it's the American, it's the Clothing and Textile Workers Union. She won that award for her investigative reporting for an article that appeared in Common Cause magazine on the military buildup in Honduras. And she's also conducting a study of the CIA's use of La Prensa to destabilize the Nicaraguan government. Jacqueline will be first. So your attention to her, please.
I think this topic is really appropriate today. I'm going to be addressing specifically the question of the administration's campaign regarding Nicaragua. It's very timely, of course, considering that another Contra aid vote is coming up next week, and the fact that Congress is still considering providing aid to the rebels is in itself evidence of how effective the administration's campaign to influence what the U.S. media and the American public think about Central America has been. What you have had since 1981 is a two-pronged effort to influence media coverage of Nicaragua. One has been run by the Central Intelligence Agency, and it has involved a campaign both in the United States and in Central America. The other is a campaign run by the National Security Council, which went into action after President Reagan signed a national security directive in January of 1983, asking that the media campaign be expanded in the United States. The National Security Council has worked primarily through the Office for Public Diplomacy for Latin America and the Caribbean, and also through different private organizations in the United States. It's important as we start out to point out that many of the activities that the State Department's Office of Public Diplomacy and other organizations within the government have been involved in do violate U.S. law. For example, in September of 1987, the General Accounting Office, the investigative arm of Congress, ruled, and I quote, "The State Department has engaged in prohibited, covert propaganda activities designed to influence the media and the public to support the administration's Latin American policies," unquote. The U.S. Comptroller General, who is a legal official of the United States government, ruled that these activities violate congressional restrictions on using funds for propaganda within the United States. Now, another thing that's important to remember is that the Central Intelligence Agency has also been involved in this effort, and that they are forbidden by their own charter and by Executive Order 12333, which was signed by President Reagan in 1981, from engaging in any domestic operation that is designed to influence U.S. political processes, political decisions, or the media. In spite of this, there is a great deal of evidence in U.S. government documents and in World Court documents that indicate that, in fact, since 1981, the Central Intelligence Agency has been engaged in a systematic campaign to control news coverage of the Nicaraguan conflict. This effort to control coverage began as the Central Intelligence Agency was working to form the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, the largest Contra organization. They worked in 81 and 82 to get this organization together, and according to Edgar Chamorro, who was the former spokesman for the FDN, the Central Intelligence Agency even chose the name of the group because they wanted to be sure to get the word democratic in the title of the organization. The Central Intelligence Agency's activities in the United States for the Contras have included writing Contra press releases and writing the FDN's Statement of Principles. supervising press conferences, including coaching Contra leaders how to lie to reporters effectively about what the Contra's purposes were, faking press events in Central America, including Contra military operations that were staged specifically for television cameras, funding a public relations office in Washington, D.C. that, according to Justice Department documents signed by the leader of this public relations office, included disseminating propaganda to the U.S. media and lobbying members of Congress. In addition, it has included specific direct lobbying efforts, including having agency personnel coach members of the Contra organization on how to lobby members of Congress, providing them with profiles of members who would be vulnerable to charges of being soft on communism, paying for lobbying trips to Washington and the members' home districts so the Contras could contact members of Congress directly. In Central America, the agency's campaign has included, again, according to documents, bribing journalists in Costa Rica and Honduras to fake stories about Contra military successes, to create or edit stories that would make the Sandinista government look bad, and also to suppress any negative information about Contra human rights abuses. In addition, the Central Intelligence Agency has funded for the last several years a weekly newsletter that goes to major newspapers throughout Latin America called Nicaragua Hoy, Nicaragua Today, which purports to tell the truth about what's happening in Nicaragua. However, the editor of this newspaper is Pedro Joaquin Chamorro Jr., one of the former editors of La Prensa. And when I talked to Pedro Joaquin about where he got his money, he said, well, I can't tell you anything about that. But other Contra leaders told me quite openly that the agency funds it. In addition, the CIA has paid for the Contras to buy a radio station in Costa Rica called Radio Impacto. Radio Impacto has one of the strongest signals in Central America. Its signal is easily picked up in Nicaragua. The money was provided by the agency, according to a number of Contra leaders whom I interviewed, and one of the techniques that the station has used is an attempt to discredit U.S. journalists that the Contra radio station's operators feel have not been negative enough toward the Sandinistas. They have personally attacked, for instance, a stringer for the Miami Herald and a former stringer for Time named June Ehrlich, calling her a piricuaca, a rabid dog who is in the pay of the Sandinista government. The reason that the Central American campaign is especially important is because what's printed in Central America about the Contras filters back up to the United States through a process called blowback. What happens is that many U.S. correspondents go to the region, pick up the newspapers there, and usually have them translated because a number of correspondents cannot speak Spanish, and then filter that information back up in their own dispatches to the United States. So what that means is that distorted or false stories that appear in the Costa Rican and Honduran media are often reprinted in the United States media as fact. This is a process that's been going on for years. One of the things that congressional officials told me worried them the most is that this kind of disinformation, this propaganda, is also filtering back into U.S. government files as fact, because there is no mechanism on the part of either the CIA or the Congress to filter disinformation from fact. And many former agents, including John, for example, will tell you that they have sometimes based analysis, intelligence analysis reports on media stories that they later found out were basically propaganda and completely untrue. There is no mechanism to keep this information from poisoning not only the files of members of Congress and the State Department, but the files of the Central Intelligence Agency itself. Let me give you just a few details about the ways in which the Central Intelligence Agency's domestic campaign has worked. One of the things the agency did from the very first was to provide trainers to coach Contra leaders on how to handle the U.S. press. Let me quote again from Edgar Chamorro, who testified before the World Court about his activities with the FDN, and who left the Contra organization because of their continued human rights abuses in 1984. He describes how CIA personnel briefed Contra leaders for their very first press conference, December 7, 1982. This is a quote. They brought 2 lawyers to a meeting with some of the members to explain the Neutrality Act to us, so that we would be able to tailor our language to make our work appear to conform to the law. They asked us the questions they anticipated would be raised in the press conference, and when we answered, quote unquote, incorrectly, or with information they did not want revealed, they instructed us to change our answers. One advisor said to me, quote, let's say a reporter asks you, Mr. Chamorro, do you receive money from the U.S. government? What will you say? My initial response was to say, yes, we've received some money. but I was told to say no. We were instructed to say that we had not met with anyone else, and it was particularly important that we deny having met with any U.S. government officials. And finally, when asked about our objectives, we were told to expressly deny that we intended to overthrow the Nicaraguan government and instead use the prefabricated phrase that we were, quote, creating conditions for democracy. The press conference was a major success. The Miami Herald, for example, reported that, quote, Directorate members denied the reports of CIA backing for FDN commandos and declined comment on military activities, saying they did not wish to violate U.S. neutrality laws. The New York Times, reporting on the press conference and an interview with Contra leader Enrique Bermudez, also publicized our apparent concern for American law and for the Neutrality Act. The appropriate message, as designed by our American friends, got across to a variety of radio and television stations, newspapers, and magazines, creating instant credibility for us. One of the recurring themes that the agency personnel emphasized was that the Contras were never to say that their purpose was to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, because at this time, throughout 1983 and 1984, President Reagan, Secretary of State George Shultz, and other high-level administration officials were saying that the Contras had been organized to interdict arms being shipped from Nicaragua to leftist rebels in El Salvador. The Contras were told to ignore these statements, and again, I'm quoting from Chamorro. The CIA agents we worked with spoke with openly and confidently about replacing the government in Managua. But the CIA instructed us that if asked, we should say that our objective was to interdict arms supposedly being smuggled from Nicaragua to El Salvador. The public statements by U.S. government officials about the arms flow, we were told by the CIA agents with whom we worked, were necessary to maintain the support of Congress and should not on any account be taken seriously by us. The agency also instructed the Contras to take credit for military operations that the agency itself was carrying out in Nicaragua in violation of U.S. and international law. These military activities included destroying Nicaraguan oil pipelines, storage tanks, communications, and military facilities. They also included bombing Managua's airport, which could have killed Senators William Cohen from the Intelligence Committee and Senator Gary Hart, who were traveling to Managua that day to meet with Sandinista leaders. But the major lie that was told was the fact that the United States had nothing to do with mining Nicaragua's harbors in 1984. In fact, Chamorro told me that at 2 o'clock in the morning, his CIA contact came to his home in Honduras and handed him a press release in Spanish and said, "Quick, go read this before the Sandinistas release it." And it was a press release saying the Contras had mined Nicaragua's harbors. Chamorro says, quote, "The truth is we played no role in the mining of the harbors, but we did as instructed." For months after that, top administration officials told newspapers and TV networks in this country that the agency and that the administration itself had no involvement with the mining. For example, Caspar Weinberger told ABC News on April 8, 1984, months afterwards, quote, "The United States is not mining the harbors of Nicaragua." When the truth finally emerged in April, editors, reporters, and members of Congress were outraged. The vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, Daniel Moynihan, threatened to resign, and Barry Goldwater, a prominent conservative who was also on the Senate Intelligence Committee, wrote to William Casey, the CIA director, saying, "Bill, this is an act of war." Now, another problem that we've had with the Central Intelligence Agency is the fact that they have underwritten this public relations firm that the Contras have operated in Washington, D.C. According to Justice Department documents that people working for foreign governments or organizations are required to file, the FDN's Washington spokesman, Bosco Matamoros, has been working under agency direction since 1981. In his Justice Department statement, Matamoros says, and again I quote, "He promotes the purposes, positions, and goals of the FDN, and through the media and otherwise, will endeavor to marshal growing American awareness of and support for the objectives of the FDN." He indicates that he's done this by preparing and disseminating, quote, "political propaganda," unquote, to the media, public officials, civic and educational groups in this country. And he did this, again I quote, "through radio and television broadcasts, magazine and newspaper articles, advertising campaign, press releases, and speeches." Another thing that the agency did was to stage news events for the U.S. media. Edgar Chamorro, who worked in Honduras for several years for the Contras, talks about several events that he staged for the networks, and again, I'm going to quote here. In October 1983, the FDN staged a Contra action for NBC correspondent Fred Francis. Contra leader Adolfo Calero and a few staff flew Francis and a camera crew in a helicopter belonging to the Honduran Air Force to Banco Grande, a base on the Honduran side of the Rio Coco. There, Calero and his men forded a knee-high river into Nicaragua, and Calero reverently picked up a handful of Nicaraguan soil for the benefit of the TV crew. On another occasion, Chamorro arranged for Maureen Moore of NBC to travel to lagoons near Puerto Lempira on the Atlantic coast of Honduras. Chamorro called ahead to the leader of one of the Mosquito Indian Contra groups and had him recruit local fishermen to don underwater diving gear and, quote, pretend they were laying mines. Mines were later actually laid by the Central Intelligence Agency, but the NBC television crew was happy to go along with our staged event and to show this, quote unquote, practice. Now, the other problem with the agency was, again, that it did assist the Contras in lobbying members of Congress by providing them with profiles and coaching. In addition, in 1983, when the agency was worried about Congress cutting funds, it got together with the National Security Council, and with the blessing of President Reagan, they started what they call a public diplomacy effort in the United States. On January 14, 1983, President Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive number 77, which was entitled Management of Public Diplomacy Relative to National Security. This called for several operations, one of which included opening the Office for Public Diplomacy for Latin America in the State Department and placing it under the direct control of the National Security Council. The Office for Public Diplomacy in Latin America did the following for U.S. reporters, and I'm quoting here from the GAO investigation done at the request of Congress. They provided false information to reporters, including information regarding drug trafficking by the Sandinistas, which is still continuing to be released. There was a long story in the LA Times yesterday about this. The Drug Enforcement Administration has consistently denied this reports and instead provided reporters with information about Contra drug trafficking allegations. In addition, it was the Office of Public Diplomacy and Oliver North who provided in 1984 the information that it was possible that Soviet MiGs were being unloaded in a harbor in Nicaragua. This made the front page of every major newspaper and was the lead story on many network newscasts. Much later, when it came out that, in fact, there were no MiGs, the story did not get nearly as large play, but administration officials admitted later in the wake of the Iran-Contra hearings that the MiG story had succeeded because it had forced newspapers to play down the 1984 elections in Nicaragua that were going on at the time. A third major story the media ran, which was completely false, was the fact that the Sandinistas had acquired chemical weapons. Another series of white propaganda operations, that's a quote from the GAO report, that the Office for Public Diplomacy was involved in, included writing op-ed pieces for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other major publications, having the staff or consultants write those stories and then put Contra leaders' names on them. In addition, the Office for Public Diplomacy worked with private organizations, including the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty and Prodemca, which is one of the organizations that was providing money to La Prensa, to sponsor Contra visits to major media in this country, but to hide the fact that the Office for Public Diplomacy was paying for this. What you have here, again, according to the Comptroller General of the United States, was a systematic effort, quote, to mislead the American public and the media to provide additional support for Reagan administration policies. Now, the Office for Public Diplomacy for Latin America and the Caribbean, it looks like it's going to be closed because Congress has decided not to fund it. But what has happened instead? Recently, there was a press release from the White House that announced that the White House had decided to sponsor a coordinator for public diplomacy for Central America in the White House Office of Communications. The man in charge of that, Crescencio Arcos Jr., is a person who worked as deputy director of the Office for Public Diplomacy. There would be a lot more information that I would like to provide you about why this has happened, why the media has fallen for this, and what we could do about it, but I've run out of time and I'd like to turn things over to Marc.
It's true that we have an abundance of talent today, and everybody is going to have to squeeze a little bit because we're on a tight schedule. So we're trying to move this along so we'll have some time for your questions and answers. Our next speaker will be John Stockwell. To some of you, he doesn't need much of an introduction. John belonged to the same organization that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North did, or does, the United States Marine Corps. After that, John went on to better things in the Central Intelligence Agency, having served our country both in Vietnam and then along with the freedom fighters in Angola until he resigned in 1977. He's currently resigned, that is, from the CIA and then decided to join the real freedom fighters. John is currently the executive director of an organization called the Association for Responsible Dissent. John?
Thank you very much. And in fact, the subject we're on to is vast and very complicated. And so far today, I think it's been just fabulous, the different insights that have been brought to it. My first choice of titles for our new organization was, by the way, Die Wimpke, which was drawn from Helen Collicott. She calls us defectors from the white male killer establishment. But thinking a minute, quickly we noted that you don't have to be white or male to have been part of the killer establishment. If you've ever paid any taxes, you're part of the establishment. And in fact, we have about 30%. I'm not sure this is a credit to women, but we're finding quite a few women who've been involved in different ways who are stepping forward, including a woman who was once recruited to assassinate Fidel Castro, as well as case officers and others. And we're also drawing people who are what you might call civilians but have expertise in the subject. Getting to the nuts and bolts of this subject today, disinformation, I want to take a liberty. I will give you a little bit of a sense of some of the nitty-gritty of disinformation. You've been hearing about it from what I would call the intermediate broad picture of the stories that are run, and the obvious lies and the manipulation. And I want to go high and low, or low and high on that. I can talk to you a little bit about how these stories are run, how you get them into the media. But then I would also like to take a liberty and put this whole thing, if you will forgive me, into the broader context of why. I mean, now, we're persuaded that the media is owned by the multinationals and is running false stories about Nicaragua. Why? And where does that fit into 1988, 1980 to 88, and what does it mean for 1988 and 89 and the presidential elections? What's going on in the world that this thing is part of? The nuts and bolts of disinformation is from a case officer's point of view, it's fun, it's challenging, it's not hard to find journalists who will carry water for you or run stories. Human foible being what it is, there is simply no limitation on the human relationships that will create a vehicle for putting stories into the press. Recruit them for money, approach them on the grounds of patriotism, approach them on the grounds of the Walter Mitty thing. I'm a journalist, but I'm also fighting for the free world. Therefore, I'll help them with this little story. A lot of back scratching goes on. The journalists, any good respected journalist coming to a country will go check with the CI chief of station to find out, what does he know? What's the interpretation? What's the word? And then eventually, the chief of station will say, hey, buddy, while you're at it, all these times I've helped you with stories that gave you an exclusive. How about running this one for me? And the journalist says, okay, or perhaps loses that, useful access. You get into a problem, however, and then there's another level where there's just full cooperation, which I'll talk about in a minute under the Reagan Revolution. But you get into a problem in sort of normal circumstances of history where you've got the journalist who's willing to run the story on your payroll, let's say, who's willing to run your story under your control. how do you give that person cover to explain to bosses and jealous colleagues where they got the story from? You've got a journalist in Paris who's on your payroll. You're covering Angola. That's the secret war that I personally supervised. I was the chief of the task force in Washington with a worldwide network working for me to run this thing, including 1/3 of my staff, propagandists, whose job was to get stories into the media that would create sympathy for our line, for what we were doing, make it look like the Soviets and Cubans were to blame. Now, again, we have on our payroll a journalist in Paris. We'll do anything we say, but you know, he walks in with a story, and his boss says, "Where'd you get that? You know, this is a story about the interior of Angola." And even if the guy flies down there, you know, their jealous colleagues are in the same hotel or watching, following each other around. And so what you've got to do to give this transfusion, you know, to stick the stuff into the blood veins of the tickers and the wire services and everything, is you've got to give them cover for their source. What we did in the Angolan operation is one standard solution, is I sent professional propagandists, CI case officers whose job was propaganda, down to Kinshasa and down to Lusaka, and they were working with the freedom fighters, as they're now called today, the FNLA in Angola, Holden Roberto's people, and UNITA, Savimbi's people, in Kinshasa and Lusaka. And our writer, my officer, would write the articles and give it to the FNLA or UNITA rep, who would give it to the local newspaper. Now, at another level, we had gone to the president, Mobutu and Kaunda, and gotten their permission. In fact, they had ordered their newspaper editors in their country to play along. So the editors were receptive, so any story that came through this link, sort of with a certain X on the corner, would be run in the paper. Then we had hired separately in the community stringers who would report to our journalists in Europe, who would send by telex, so that you would have Dateline, Kinshasa, the Elimo newspaper, or the Salongo newspaper, and this article. And our journalist in Europe could then walk into his boss with this thing that the stringer had sent him on, you know, telex, and it was in fact a clipping, and it could be run, put into Reuters or AFP, and run internationally on the wire services. Now, the subtleties of this thing, it's delicate. It's, you know, the professional details that you have to watch out for. For example, in one case, we had a hot rod in Lusaka who was a hard charger, a little bit out of control. Another one of these guys, like Oliver North, whose gyroscope wasn't bolted down completely, you know. And he immediately came up with a story whereby he had the UNITA forces taking the city of Mosamedis and capturing 40-some-odd Russian advisors. Well, he'd made this up. I mean, this is propaganda, you know, and he'd made it up. But see, this would show the world that this was Russian aggression in Angola that we were countering. Problem, see, that's a big story. Russians being captured in a black African country. What's Savimbi going to do with them, you know, when he captures them? So every journalist from all the major organs of the world descended on Lusaka and rented planes and flew into Silva Porto to find these Russians and see how they were being treated and what was going to happen. And what they found was Jonas Savimbi, who at that time had not been taught by the CI to lie. We've taught him, and now he's got it down pat. But back then, he was fairly straightforward and honest. And he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. My troops are 70 miles from Mosamedis. We're not even close. I don't think we're going to be able to take it. And I personally don't think there are any Russians in Angola." Now, they all flew away, and we began to get very hysterically nasty comments from our men in Paris, you know, saying, what the hell are you doing to me, you know? Because of the scrutiny from his bosses and colleagues about where did you get this story so flagrantly false. So the guy in Lusaka came up with a better line. He came up with a story, and we kept it running for weeks, whereby we had it that Cuban soldiers had raped a bunch of teenage Angolans. And now everybody ran that, no questions asked, because everybody in the world knows that the Cubans are evil communist rapists. So no editor is going to challenge that story very much. And then he had a battle, and then he had the Cuban soldiers captured, and then he had them put on trial, and then eventually he had them executed by a firing squad of the young women who had been raped, including photographs of kind of, actually they were kind of frumpy 15-year-olds with rifles that were bigger than they were, supposedly executing these Cuban rapists. And these ran all over the world, papers all over the United States. Now, some subtle ethnic problems that murder. People don't like to kill each other in that part of Africa. I lived there for many, many years as a child, and then as a chief of base, I was bilingual and a little bit into the culture. They don't like to kill because in their religion they believe that you kill someone, the spirit hangs around for a while and kind of haunts you. And so to cope with this, what you have to do is there's a ritual and a formality and what we would call witch doctors, and you have to pay a bunch of goats and chickens to buy protection against the spirit of the person you've killed. And so, firing squad stuff, they really wouldn't like that, and especially the women. It's just utter balderdash to visualize women, especially young women from that part of Africa, standing on a firing squad and shooting down, But nevertheless, it fit all of the stereotypical images, so nobody challenged it. So we ran this story for weeks, convincing lots of people of these evil communists raping, people in Africa and whatnot. Now, the parallels between the Angolan operation and the Nicaraguan operation are extensive. You have certain geographical realities, and so you have forms and formats. If you take my book In Search of Enemies and change the names, you've got Nicaragua, Angola to Nicaragua. Lots of parallels, especially at the outset. The Angolan thing was a little larger at the outset. It didn't go as long because, and get this is very important, stick this in your mind, because it is possible, because the Congress stopped us by voting a cessation of the funds. Now remember that, because it could be done in Nicaragua. And the Nicaraguan situation has gone on now for 7 years, and the horror and suffering and whatnot. And we've gone back eventually into Angola. Now, differences, of course, in the two operations. One is a different era. We ran ours right after the Vietnam War, and they're running theirs, and the pendulum swinging back and forth. Now, President Reagan has been bragging about the Contra operation almost from the outset, whereas in the Angolan operation, there was great paranoia and fear that we would be caught, that we would be exposed. The church committee was meeting in session while we were running a covert operation. People were telling me in the hallway, watch it, cover your ass, write notes to yourself, because there's going to be hearings and somebody's going to go to jail. And that's part of the reason why my book has lots of detail in it, is because I was sitting there writing notes to myself, not thinking about writing a book, but just in terms of the advice I'd been given. The Contra operation in Nicaragua, and this is where I want to get beyond the nuts and bolts, because I do believe it's important, is a different thing, a different era in history. Take it back to the Vietnam War. You recall that Walter Cronkite and Anthony Lewis and lots of others had been for our involvement in Vietnam. And then as the society began to come apart, as the establishment began to lose control of the society, they decided to get out, and then the media turned and actually began to put pressure on the operatives, the people filled with the function lust, and the politicians committed to certain lines to force them to get out of the Vietnam War. For background on this, of course, there's one excellent book, which is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, and his pointing out, as he puts it in a paper following that book, that the powers that be gave us Jimmy Carter as a sop because of the anger that had been generated by harsher presidents in the Vietnam era. Now, having had his time and disappointed nearly everyone, the liberal Jimmy Carter, then they went back to their A-team, to their first string, running President Reagan back in office. But what we have here is the Reagan Revolution, of course, a conservative revolution, which I personally interpret as an effort by the right, by the establishment, to weld the pendulum shut over to the right. To summarize briefly what we've been watching happening over these years, their first thing he did was to set out to break down and capture control of the United States government. These appointments like James Watt and Alfred Regnery and Ann Burford and all of the others, Ed Meese's outrageous statements, to shake apart the traditions and get control of the government bureaucracy. To popularize war, which this actor president of ours, of course, has done with tremendous success, to pass a string of laws that would give protection to the government, to government employees, to secret operatives, to national security employees, so they could run their operations without fear of being prosecuted or sued, to supervise the most expensive arms buildup in the history of the world, and to appoint judges to back up the new laws. Meanwhile, from the outset, going back to the original planning back in 1969, in California, Louis Giuffrida, the California Special Training Institute, working up the techniques of population control and telling us in speeches that the Vietnam War, that's the last one. The next war is not going to be fought the same way with people taking to the streets with the battlefield, the general's second guest on television after they fight battles. Louis Giuffrida was put in charge of this FEMA thing and immediately began planning, setting up the infrastructure for eventual martial law, for a suspension of the Constitution and taking over the reins of power in this country. So in the next national emergency, there would not be a problem of masses of people demonstrating on the streets, threatening the establishment's locks on the society itself. The plan, as I saw it, as I've been lecturing, if you've heard my lectures and interpreted it since 1983 when I began to study it more seriously, was they were working towards an invasion of Nicaragua, at which time they would have their war and their national emergency, and then at that time they would have the license to use the FEMA laws to suppress dissent and get a lock again on this society like no one has ever had before, to weld the pendulum shut to the right. Now, to finance this thing, this arms buildup, they've had to cut every social service in this country. Potentially this is unpopular. To sell it to the people in this country, what they've had to do is create a violent world. They've been working on that one for 3 or 4 decades. Since they created the CIA, you're familiar with the figures, they've run about 3,000 major covert operations and something around 10 to 12,000 minor operations. Obviously, if we had more time, I would get into the details and the stuff that we know about them. We guesstimate very roughly, and nobody will ever know for sure, but at least 6 million people have been killed by these things, almost altogether in the third world. Each person survived by perhaps 5 loved ones, leaving the world, of course, a much less stable place, in an unstable, dangerous, violence-filled world. Then you can justify an arms race, and in the danger you can justify harsh measures and laws and restrictive laws. You can justify national security and national security laws. In this context, I suggest that the Nicaraguan Contra aid, that Nicaragua is in fact a designated enemy. You have to have a focal point for the paranoia and the macho, the aggression, in order to get the nation rallied behind you. And it's also a diversion. President Reagan has clearly focused more presidential energy on Nicaragua, a country that has 2 elevators, than he has any other problem facing this great nation of ours. Meanwhile, as you well know, the world economy is in dire straits, and Japan has managed to capture 30% of the international overseas exchange. Now, this could work only if you had the complicity of the 4th and 5th legs of the military-industrial complex. Traditionally, they talk about the Iron Triangle. It's really a pentagon. You have the defense contractors, of course, in the Defense Department and the Congress. We know all about that, but the 4th leg is the media. And that's what this conference has been about. The media's role, how it works, its biases, how it carries water for the rest of the revolution. And the 5th, of course, is the Defense Department itself. The press in this situation has been in open support of the Reagan's activities in Nicaragua, and this is a big difference. They haven't had to play the games that we had to play in Nicaragua. Kinzer, Lemoyne, the others down there have been openly running the stories and distorting the truth. Christopher Dickey, for example, who wrote the wonderful book With the Contras, if you read the inside page, his first credit acknowledgement is to express his deep admiration and respect for the men and women of the CIA. So then you come to the question, this Reagan Revolution, this plot, this coup d'etat, how close did they come? with this revolution to it happening. The best way that I can read it, talking to the best heads I know in Washington, in October of '86, the date for the invasion of Nicaragua had been fixed for February of 1987. They were sidetracked by the Iran-Contra scandal, and this at least put a hitch in their revolutionary plans. These people that David Broder called in the White House running this thing, that he said had beady eyes and ears that twitch, were thrown out of office, and they took a step back. The hearings of this past summer should be seen as damage control, papering the thing over as best they can, blaming it on mismanagement, and they did not, therefore, get into the real questions of drug dealing, of assassination, of racketeering, the question of the propriety of covert action, should our government be permitted to do this sort of thing, and the question of impeaching the administration for plotting a coup d'etat against, please, I read the first note. I'll be finished in just a minute.
I yield my time.
No, sir, we've lost 2 minutes by the notes. I'm sorry. I am running over my time. Nevertheless, I think it's important for you to understand why the media is playing the games it has been playing. It's because it is part of the Reagan Revolution. What we're going to witness in the days to come, I predict, some version, details will vary, will be the trial, the indictments, the trial and the pardon of Oliver North, John Poindexter, and Richard Secord. And that will leave us with the question of how much has the conservative revolution been hurt by the Iran-Contra scandal. And the answer to that is that the destabilization of Nicaragua continues today. What was illegal under the Boland Amendment times is legal today. They're parachuting arms in teams. They're still lying in the media to cover it up, to distract the American people. FEMA's planning continues at full pace. And George Bush, the vice president, who has almost direct links through Don Gregg, through Felix Rodriguez, through this program they've set up down there with Jorge Ochoa, the head of the Colombian cocaine cartel, is running for president instead of being impeached or tried for racketeering. And he is right now leading all the other candidates in the race for the future president of this country. If he wins, of course, you can expect the Contra program to continue and the Reagan Revolution in a different form with a different name to continue. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and we're hoping again to leave time for questions and answers. And I guess I've been taught what happens when I try and switch roles and become a moderate and assume power. So now I will shift positions and move into the opposition. I wanted to speak to you today. Jonathan Kwitny, by the way, will speak to you, even if we have to extract it from him. I would like to try and bring together some of the different things we've heard up to now, and I'd also like to raise a little bit of a counterpoint to what has been said so far. Not that I disagree substantially with most of what has been said, but I'd like to try and challenge us together to try and use some of that information that we may have picked up today. First thing is that I'm a little concerned, not today, because I, as other people on this panel, certainly John, I know many times has come to Los Angeles to speak on this same subject. I'm a little disturbed because I get the feeling sometimes that those of us who are here in a gathering like this today feel that we've made a discovery of fire, that we've discovered something new, that we've discovered something called disinformation. It's something like, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who happens to be a red diaper baby, which I'm not. I was a red, white, and blue diaper baby. But a red diaper baby, and this friend of mine said to me, you know, my grandfather Saul said, never believe anything you read in the capitalist press. And he was saying this, 70 or 80 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago, as the case may be, long before theories of disinformation and misinformation were highly developed or evolved. That's not to say that disinformation doesn't exist, because we know it does, and you hear it. Just a few minutes ago, you heard from somebody whose job it was to plant or to help evolve or generate some of that disinformation on a U.S. government salary. In the case of John, and in the case of the documentation you've heard from Jacqueline, exactly how that disinformation is created at the official levels, how it's planted and how it's propagated. But again, I remain a little uncomfortable, because I just need to ask, are we putting a very fancy label on something that is in fact quite simpler? If we remember back to the Nixon administration, we remember words like reactive sortie, which used to be called an air raid, or calling something as simple. Are we putting a label as sophisticated as disinformation on something that most of the world recognizes as government lying, which I don't think, and I know that I'm treading on thin ice here, but I'll tell you where I'm headed. Jonathan Kwitny said earlier today that all governments lie. Well, I accept that pretty much as a universal truth. That doesn't mean that I'm a cynic and believe that all governments are the same. That's not what I'm saying. It's only natural that an entrenched group, an entrenched power center, be it a power group or a government that you approve of or disapprove of, that is regressive or progressive, that is reactionary or revolutionary, it's only natural that that government, which has to stabilize itself and keep itself in power, etc., probably is going to do its best to at least influence the press. And it's perfectly legitimate to try and influence the press, no matter who you are. You would assume that you're going to do that to further your interests. And it would be silly to believe that a state, which certain theoreticians that predated my birth referred to as special bodies of armed men, it would seem that the state would only use all the levers at its reach to try and manipulate, fabricate, distort public opinion, lie, cheat, and steal to further its interests. I think we've established that today. And I think we've established it a long time ago. And what concerns me is I am delighted to see 1,500 people come today to hear a day-long conference on government lying and manipulation of the press. I recognize many friends here, not everybody, but I've seen many people before. And I'm sure that many of us knew before we got here today that the government lied, and that there was a disinformation campaign about Vietnam, about Angola, about Grenada, about Nicaragua, etc. We may not know all the details. I don't think that any of you who were here today were avid listeners of the Voice of America this morning and decided to stop listening after my good friend Lorian Alexander gave her magnificently researched talk on it. So the real question is, I want to be very clear, that does not to say that what we talk about isn't legitimate, because it is. But it seems to me that two questions must be raised. And that is, once we've established that the government lies, cheats, distorts, and manipulates the press, and not just the government, what is it that we can do about it? And what is our relationship to the media? And when I say relationship, I'm making an assumption. And the assumption that I make, and I might be wrong, but I don't think so, the assumption that I make is that most of the people here today are not interested in the media in itself or per se. They're interested in the media, or you are interested in the media because you are people who have a certain amount of social or political consciousness, are probably political activists, have things that you care very much about and wish to change in society, and are constantly frustrated and angered by the way the press distorts and ignores the issues that are important to you. Is that a reasonable assumption? So it seems to me that the press, maybe there's a jump in logic, but it seems to me that the press should then be for you a secondary issue. Because the things that you're concerned about is not primarily Dan Rather's salary or the membership of the board of directors of the Wall Street Journal, for example, or the subscription levels of KPFK, but rather what you're interested in is stopping the war in Nicaragua, and you're interested in building social justice in the United States, and you're interested in electing and supporting a government in the United States that represents your interests instead of that of a very few privileged people in this society. And what that means to me is that there's a certain danger, and I'm just raising this, I'm just being a little bit of a skeptic, that's all. There's a danger in some of the things that we do, and I say we in all sincerity, because I make my living to a great degree by critiquing the press and also working for it, which is one of the marvelous contradictions of a market society. It would seem to me then that the question that we have to raise is, to what degree then do we become cooperative participants in a passive media culture? And that is to say, to what degree do we then begin to channel our zeal and our energy in changing the society? To what degree do we channel that into becoming passive critiquers or critics of some very convenient people to beat up? That is to say, and I think I hope what I'm saying is clear, but what I'm trying to say is that to what degree then do we begin to abdicate our responsibility to effect social change and essentially absolve ourselves from responsibility to make that change because we find it very convenient to say, well, we can't do it because we're not getting a fair hearing in the press. And the problem is that I know for a fact, because I've given many media workshops to many, many activist groups, and I've heard it very clearly in very clear English. What I hear is a desperate and understandably desperate appeal from fellow social activists who, faced with the prospect of trying to change the political consensus that has dominated this country since the end of World War II, what I hear is a plea to not make us have to do it, but if we could just find a way to get X story onto CBS, then that would just turn the whole tide. I cannot tell you how many times in the last 8 months, or 6 or 7 months since May, where I've spoken, I've been asked the question, well, why didn't the media cover the story of the Contra drug connection? Well, how did everybody hear about this story? And believe me, if you've read my column, I'm not here to absolve the media. I find myself being increasingly blacklisted because of my rather frontal attacks on many of my employers, or former employers. I'm not here to absolve the media. But the fact is, by the way, that I was watching West 57th Street in a program produced by Alexander Coburn's sister-in-law, Leslie Coburn, on CBS in prime time, in English, in color, where several pilots in the Oliver North Contra Supply Network got on the air and said, yes, we flew guns into Costa Rica, and then we loaded the cargo planes with dope, and we unloaded them at Fort, I was going to say Fort Lauderdale, but at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, right? I heard that. How many of you heard that? Yeah. All right. Now, that doesn't mean that the media gave it all the coverage it should have. But, you know, a spot on CBS in prime time beats Mother Jones and In These Times. The problem is, what did the American people do when they saw that? A lot of people didn't see it. And a lot of us said, oh, God, it's on CBS. Isn't that great? Just like I heard an announcement from the Christic Institute yesterday that said, make sure and watch Cagney and Lacey next Tuesday night, because next Tuesday night in Cagney and Lacey, there's going to be a plug for the Christic Institute lawsuit. Well, so what? I mean, that's nice, but I'm being acerbic for a reason. What do you think that is going to do in itself? It might have a value, but it only has value if real, live human beings like you and me are doing all that dirty work that needs to be done in order to organize society. Because television, CBS, and ABC, and NBC, and the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times is not going to do your work for you, no matter how good or bad they are. And they are not good. Okay? So the point that I'm trying to make is that, and I think Alexander Coburn touched on it. This morning. Unfortunately, he was also running out of time, and he condensed it into just a line or two, and I will take a minute and expand it into 3 or 4 lines, which is the problem in the United States with the media is not a media problem. It's the same problem that you have with banking in the United States, or the same problem that you have with insurance companies in the United States. Except it's complicated with the media. First, it is, as Herb Schiller said, a question of structural ownership. It is a question of who owns the media. And I think we know that. I'm not going to belabor that. I think you all know that. So I'll just let that go. But the media is complicated because it's also got to do with consciousness. It's not just an insurance company. It also has to do with thought and ideology. The fact is that the media of the United States, to a great degree, reflects a predominant cultural and political consensus that does exist in the United States. Now, there's 2 ways to look at it. I have heard that 67% of the American people, or 45%, I don't know what the figure is anymore, but whatever the percentage is, some majority of the American people oppose aid to the Contras. Now, on a statistical basis, that means in Los Angeles County, somewhere around 4 or 5 million people oppose the Contras. How many will be at the federal building tonight protesting the Contra aid? What difference does it make what your attitude is if you do not put your thought into action? And that is the point. That's the point that I raise about this conference. This conference is very nice. As Herb Schiller said this morning, he hasn't seen this many people in all of his speaking engagements totaled up in the last 10 years. But all of this will mean nothing if everybody goes home and then says, boy, I really heard the truth about the media tonight, you know. They're really a bunch of manipulating bastards. And I'm going to watch Cagney and Lacey. And then when Bill Moyers has a documentary on, I'm going to call up my friends who already agree with me and tell them to watch Bill Moyers' documentary on the secret government. How many of you saw that? Half the room, right? A great documentary. How many of you learned something from that you didn't know before? A couple of hands. Okay? That's the point. That's not to say that documentary shouldn't have been made. But the final point is, and I was supposed to talk about Nicaragua. The final point is that there is a consensus in this country. And I think Jonathan Kwitny may or may not want to address this point, but Jonathan is the only member of this panel who has worked for years on a daily establishment newspaper. I have done that on and off, and I've been in news organizations on and off. I don't have the experience that he does, but I guarantee you that it is true that nobody has to, just as Peter Jennings said about the Soviet press in that film clip we saw this morning, nobody has to tell people how to report. There's no political commissar. There's no political editor. There's nobody who says you can do this or you cannot do this. You know what you can do. And it is, and that's for the people who even ask themselves the questions. Because I would say that most reporters don't even have to ask themselves the questions because it comes naturally. Because you know, just as you have to write in English You know that there's certain concepts that are accepted by our culture, and there's certain concepts that are not. That if you find a 72-year-old senile man who claims to be the United States dropping bombs on 7-year-old children in Managua, in the United States that's not considered pathological behavior. So that's not a news story in itself. If, however, you find somebody who eats crocodile hearts, for example, or I'm just pulling that out of the air, that could be a nice human interest story because it's not something that is so natural to us. And just in the same way that you find that it's perfectly harmonious with our worldview to believe that society should be organized on a free market basis, that the media should be privately owned, and that all economic power should be concentrated in the hands of small monopolies, or large monopolies owned by small numbers of people, just the way that we think that's a perfectly natural way of doing things, we think that anything that interrupts that order is unnatural and therefore warrants critical news reporting. So, all of this to say one thing. I agree with Alexander Coburn that it is incumbent upon you, just as it is incumbent upon you to go to the Contra demonstration tonight, it is also incumbent upon you to harass the media, to call them up when you see something you do not like. When you think there should be other spokespeople on the air who are not there, you should call them. When you see their reporting is distorted, you should call them, because I'm sure what Jonathan Kwitny said is true. If you get 25 letters, the editors probably go into a panic. And with 50, they're probably in a cold sweat. But having done that, you're not off the hook. That's the whole point of this 15-minute spiel of mine. You're not off the hook after you have made the fantastic discovery that your enemy is your enemy. After you have identified your enemy and realized that your enemy is not on your side, then it's time to build up your side. I will now tell you that putting on my hat as moderator and returning to a smile, I'll tell you that Jonathan Kwitny is one of the few well-published, I hate to use the word establishment because that doesn't mean anything, but I will say it, establishment employees of the press whose reporting I can most rely upon. Jonathan Kwitny.
I'm a last-second addition to this panel, so I'll begin with two optimistic notes. One is that I'll be brief, and the other is that if John is right about pardons coming to the first group of expectant indictees, Norton, McFarland, and Poindexter, and Secord, and Gadd, and Dutton, and Hakim, that would simply allow their testimony to be compelled against Weinberger and Schultz and Bush. I usually try to be even-handed. That I thought about whether to say that. It's possible. My own reading of Walsh is that he's going to stop short of that for reasons we can all understand. I usually try to be even-handed about dealing with Republicans and Democrats and so forth because we are faced with a problem that this national security phenomenon that's gone on with both parties for 40 years. But I think in saying that, you do have to recognize that the Reagan administration has really gone beyond anything that has gone before in the way of being able to control opinion and control the dissemination of news. It begins with the personality of the president, who, whether you liked it or not, came into office with most of the people of this country really liking him personally, whether they agreed with him or not. He is a master at communications. But there's also been a system set up at the White House that's unlike any before that has controlled the flow of news. It's been designed so that literally every morning from the beginning of the administration, a group of people get together in the White House Communications Office and basically determine a line of the day, it was called, a positive aspect that they wanted to put across for reporters to cover. this would go out over computers to all the government departments, to any secretary, assistant secretary that might be involved in it. The probable questions that might be asked by members of the press after the morning briefing, and what the responses should be. It's been very tightly coordinated, or what the responses should not be. And the way a number of the, disinformation, whatever kind of campaigns you want to call them, have been handled, I think reflect also how very professionally this has been done, beginning with the white paper on El Salvador that I talked about briefly this morning. And I think from what Jacqueline said, you could infer that that had more importance than one originally assumed, because, as she pointed out, the Nicaraguan war, essentially the Contras, their justification was to interdict the flow of arms. So to prove that there was a flow of arms from Nicaragua to El Salvador was the beginning building block of the whole justification for the Contra war. And that white paper was very cleverly sold. First, the idea behind the white paper was leaked by a very high official to a particularly vulnerable reporter on the New York Times who was might be sympathetic to that point of view. Had no real information about it, but it was arranged that somebody else could confirm the existence of these stolen guerrilla documents, which would prove beyond doubt the truth of the notion that the Salvadoran War was the direct result of Soviet arms flowing in from Nicaragua. After this comes out at the top of page 1 at the New York Times, other papers want to follow it. Editors say, why didn't you get a scoop like this? This is important stuff. So people begin to approach persons in government, and the leak of it is very carefully controlled so that the story will get out before anybody has a chance to examine the documentation that supposedly underlies the story. Even when the white paper itself, it's been leaked several times, and other papers are quoting other papers, and television is saying the New York Times reported this morning that. Then when they finally do give out the white paper, the book of documents that they have, there are only a few of them. For some reason, they conveniently run out of them. So nobody really gets a chance to examine the documentation behind it before reporting that the government has this conclusive evidence on the basis of stolen documents that this is a Soviet invasion via Nicaragua into El Salvador, justifying the establishment of the Contras. Weeks later, when the documents are made available, almost nobody takes the time to read them because the story is established. Jacqueline also mentioned the issue of drugs. And Jacqueline, did you ever get into the Barry Seal story or do any reporting on that, the statements by high government officials that the Nicaraguan government had cooperated with the Ochoa cartel in flying drugs here?
Yeah, I was told. I mean, it was obvious to me that was just totally off the wall. I never used any of this stuff. But yes, government officials did say those things to me very clearly.
Well, I had last April or May a page 1 piece in the Wall Street Journal basically saying that the evidence that had been supplied to prove that so far rested on the word of a convicted dope smuggler and inveterate liar named Barry Seal, who got out of a 20-year jail sentence for saying these things. And that yet the basis of it was, and I think a real problem, and John alluded to this too, is that the Reagan administration has really perverted the justice system in order to propagate its propaganda. In controlling the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office, so that a number of cases where there was very clear evidence of Contras involved in drug dealing were covered up, delayed, swept under the rug, and yet the word of this one guy who had been turned down as a government informant by the drug enforcement agents and U.S. attorneys in 2 states, his word against the Sandinistas became the basis for a criminal indictment, which then led to the conviction of some minor people who no doubt did import cocaine. But the use of this information by the president, by Schultz, by other administration spokesmen testifying before Congress to make these assertions that the Nicaraguan government was involved in dope smuggling consciously. President Reagan himself went on national television with a big photograph of what was supposed to be leading drug dealers surrounded by Nicaraguan soldiers whom you conveniently could not see in the photograph, protecting the onloading of cocaine on an airstrip, supposedly a military airfield. Actually, what the airfield turned out to be a civilian airfield near Managua, although from the photographs you couldn't tell where it was. It could have been in anybody's backyard. It's still possible that it will turn out the Nicaraguans had some involvement in drug dealing, but this kind of story shows how a willful and very clever White House information control medium can control information and get it in the press, and how a lazy press corps accepts it and really doesn't challenge it.
I would like to add something to that, actually, because I think this drug story is something that has been incredibly pervasive and has come up again and again and again since 1983. And I'd like to just point out two things that the major media did not cover, and in fact I worked for the Washington Post for several years, so I feel very free to criticize the major media. One is that there was a court case in California where two drug dealers who had been in Costa Rica were arrested in California and brought to trial. And one of the things they said was, well, we were running these drugs for the Contras based in Costa Rica, and so that money should be sent to them. And the judge sent the money to the Contra groups in Costa Rica. Now, that story got very little coverage. Another thing that was really interesting to me that sort of backs up what Jonathan was saying is that the Iran-Contra documents themselves, and agreed there were a lot of them, have lots of references to drug dealing. There is a memorandum from Rob Owen, who was Colonel North's liaison in Costa Rica, who was talking about a Contra group that, in fact, I spent a lot of time with in 1985, saying we really have to be careful about controlling what gets out about this group because we know that so-and-so, who is one of the leaders of this group, has been involved in drugs. Several references.
He named two people in that memo, and there are other memos.
And there are others. Where is the media coverage of this? So whereas none of these references in the Iran-Contra documents are followed up, yesterday I arrive in Los Angeles and pick up the LA Times, and here's a story again about the Sandinistas involved in the cocaine trade, all based on anonymous sources. When the same reporters could go, and get the court documents from California and spend the time going through the Iran-Contra documents and talk to the DEA, which, after President Reagan's speech in April of 1986, in which he said the Contras were running drugs, the DEA came out the next day and said, I'm sorry, we have no information about the Sandinistas being involved in drug running. But the problem is that all of these, well, gee whiz, we found out the story wasn't true. It comes later, and it is not given the same kind of play that the original story is given. I was very grateful after President Reagan's 1986 speech, which was sort of a benchmark, that the Associated Press put a reporter on tracking down the charges that the president had made in that speech about persecution of the Jews in Managua, about drug running, about the Nicaraguans sending arms to leftist rebels in Brazil. And the Brazilian government demanded to know where that information had come from, and the State Department had to back off and apologize to the Brazilian government. That story in the newspaper where I live in Tucson, Arizona, ran on page 3 and was cut. That story did not make the front page, top of the fold headlines that the president's speech had made. And when Jonathan's talking about the El Salvador white paper, that white paper was discredited. He was the one who wrote one of the original stories, actually reading the documents. But many newspapers never even ran the stories, that the white papers were totally discredited. The person who wrote them for the State Department actually came out and said, well, yeah, we sort of guessed at the figures, and there were problems with the translating, and, well, I'm not really sure where some of these documents came from. That white paper continued to be quoted to me when I would go to Washington and go to the State Department. They'd continue to give me this white paper as if it were authoritative. And when I would raise questions about it, there'd be this enormous official anger, and I would be sort of escorted out of the office. So there is this continual problem that you get, that even when something is discredited, it is still used. And reporters going down to Central America without the kind of experience and background in dealing with the government and this kind of attempt to control the news, they accept this stuff and they continue to quote from it, just as there were quotes from William Casey, President Reagan, George Shultz, up all through 1984, about the fact that the only reason we were supporting the Contras was to interdict arms being shipped to El Salvador, despite the fact that in May of 1983, a year, 18 months earlier, the House Intelligence Committee had issued a public report, very unusual, a public report in which they recommended that funding for the Contras be eliminated because the members of that committee, and this was a bipartisan report, did not believe the Central Intelligence Agency's explanation that the reason that the Contras being funded was to interdict arms shipments. There you have the House Intelligence Committee, Republicans and Democrats, saying this in May of 83, and up through 84, the President, the Secretary of State are saying the same thing, and the media is still quoting them without backgrounding it and saying, however, according to a May 1983 House report, etc. So one of the problems is we do not do our homework, we meaning the media in general. We have people going to Central America who have no background in the region, who do not speak Spanish, I have had reporters come to me, because I'm bilingual, I lived in Latin America for a long time, come to me literally and say, I'm only here for 24 hours, what's going on here?
But there are reporters like there are reporters like Stephen Kinzer who speak Spanish, who wrote some of the most authoritative books possible on the history of the region, and still will produce that kind of reporting. And I want to insist that the reason is political. It's not. It is true what Jacqueline said. Some reporters do not know their elbow from their knee, and don't know what country they're in, and have got 24 hours. That's true. That happens all the time, and on every beat, not just Central America, because in journalism school they teach you how to type instead of teaching you something about the world. But the point is that I think there's what some people have called a hierarchy of credibility, and that's partially the way journalism is done in the United States. It's certainly the way it's taught, but it's also a cultural and social function that's not going to be eliminated by just criticizing the media. It's the way that we as Americans look at the world. And reporters for American papers are Americans. And they go to American schools and they watch American televisions and they have mothers and fathers who are American. And they have a way of looking at the school. And they believe certain sources are credible and certain ones are not. If you live in Italy and the president of the Chamber of Deputies is a communist, and then you don't believe that somebody who's in the Communist Party is necessarily a non-credible source. If you live in the United States and communists are either hiding or they're silly old people passing out leaflets or they're in jail, then you tend to go to William Casey for your authoritative quotes. I'm sorry, Jonathan. Are you finished? Do you want to continue with your presentation?
Did I? No, I did. I wondered what you meant. Let me ask you what you meant. When you said what Kinzer did was caused by the reasons were political, do you mean political ideological? Do you mean political in his own career within the paper? How do you mean?
It's an excellent question, and I don't purport. The answer is that I do not purport to know what's in Stephen Kinzer's head, so I cannot answer the question. Though I made an assertion, and it's unfair for me to have said that Kinzer does it for political reasons. What I want to say is that many reporters like Kinzer, who in fact do speak Spanish and do know the region, and perhaps even know better, right, have political reasons of both sorts. There's certainly there's the small p political reasons of your career and go along to get along, and not wind up like Ray Bonner and shipped out to sea. But there's also the political ideological reasons, where you understand or where you have internalized certain concepts. I'll give an example. As a news reporter that there's a certain ethic in news writing. There's a certain form of what's acceptable. And in shorthand, if you make an assertion, generally your editors should require you to substantiate it, unless they are assertions that are so universally accepted that they need no substantiation. For example, if you say Nicaragua is in Central America, that can stand. You don't have to say Nicaragua's in Central America according to the latest atlas published by Hammond, right? If you say that Daniel Ortega threatened war against Honduras, then your editor is probably going to ask you for substantiation of that, and you have to produce a quote, right, real or imagined. Okay? The point is that if you look at what goes as unsubstantiated, you begin to see the cultural and political biases. For example, if you read closely, or not so closely, reporting on the Third World, you will see many times a statement saying, without assertion, that in Angola or in Mozambique or in Managua, one of the reasons for economic disarray is, quote, Marxist mismanagement of the economy. And that stands without substantiation because it is a universal enough truth in this country that Marxism and collectivization of the economy produces mismanagement. Okay? Correct. I mean, and that is, as Eric just said, in the current situation with Central America, there are certain things that begin to slip, become disputed, that were disputed 2 years ago and now are accepted. 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, in 1982 or 1983, if you were a reporter for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, you probably had to qualify any statements that just asserted that the governments of El Salvador and Guatemala were democratic. You'd have to say emerging democracies or governments undergoing a democratic process or governments that the administration says it's encouraging a democratic process in. Today, they are now routinely called the 4 democratic countries. And that's because that has been assimilated already into the official, if you will, culture. But I think we should do you want to respond to that, Jonathan?
No, let's open it up.
Let's take questions. We're going to ask you, we have till 3:45, so you can pace yourselves. Please, we know it's a very political audience, so save your political declarations for the rally tonight. We want one-sentence questions. Please.
Mr. Stockwell, Jacqueline was fired from that position there in Sweden, and Albert Gore had a role in that. Do you know anything about that? Supposedly sort of walked the fence and told the Democrats that CI closed down the control center outside of Washington. And he told the Republicans, I closed it down because there was a wet bar in there, and I didn't let anything else get out. Do you know anything more about what's going on?
The question is, I believe the question did the former FEMA director was fired? Perhaps Albert Gore had a role in that, and what's going on with FEMA in that question? FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that question is to John Stockwell.
I draw a blank, but I hope someone else is on top of it and can jump in. Jonathan? Jacqueline? No, this is something that I think we should follow very closely, and I've been very disappointed that the press didn't hammer away at it since James Brooks, since the Miami Herald brought it out this summer. FEMA is a direct threat to our Constitution and our democracy. I'd like to see a lot of coverage of it.
Yes, sir.
It's a question for Jacqueline mainly, but if any of the rest of you want to address it. Basically, I'm interested in a good resource book or maybe articles, but something on this disinformation campaign that you were talking about. That information is really interesting to me, and I'd like to do some more research on my own.
Did you all hear the question? Yeah. Good resource book or good resource material on the current disinformation campaigns in Nicaragua, I believe. Is that correct? Yes. In general.
Well, good books and resources on disinformation. Frankly, I did a long story for Common Cause magazine, September and October of 1986, which outlined in tremendous detail the CIA's domestic campaign and also their campaign in Central America. In addition to that sort of baseline story, the Institute for Media Analysis in New York has put out 2 monographs, one by Morley and Petrus with an introduction by Noam Chomsky, and another one by Edgar Chamorro concerning disinformation regarding Nicaragua. Magazines like The Nation, for example, have sort of recurring stories 2 or 3 times a year that will mention disinformation campaigns. The Miami Herald has gone after the Office for Public Diplomacy in a very responsible way, I think. And when the General Accounting Office report came out in September, concerning OPD and how it had violated congressional restrictions. You did have coverage on that specific issue in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but the Miami Herald stories began even last summer based on the Iran-Contra documents. As far as books go, I think Chomsky's books concerning propaganda and disinformation have been very important. There's also a new magazine called Propaganda Review that's put out in San Francisco that I expect to have a lot of good. It's just begun. It's new, and also, frankly, FAIR's publications. This month's issue has a long piece about Otto Reich, who ran the Office for Public Diplomacy, and they regularly have information about this particular problem.
The LA Weekly did a great issue some time ago about this.
Someone just said the LA Weekly had an issue about disinformation.
Don't forget the Covert Action Information Bulletin, which has been pounding away on the subject of disinformation for a lot of years now.
All right, more questions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I need your question. Okay. Who is that question directed to? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, she was mentioning something about the fact that the administration's breaking the law and how come we aren't saying more than that. Actually, I do have a law degree from Yale, so that's one of the reasons I'm interested in it. But it is, in fact, I think very alarming that the administration has broken the law in terms of using the Office for Public Diplomacy for domestic propaganda, and that the agency has violated Executive Order 12333 consistently since 1981, and the media is not even reporting on that aspect of things, which I think is a sign of the fact that this administration has gone farther than previous administrations in terms of, damage control and self-aggrandizement, which characterized previous administrations, to really a very overt campaign to control media content about Central America as much as possible.
We have.
The question is, why isn't there more reporting about this? Part of it is because the whole issue is complicated. And most reporters do not have a legal background and aren't aware of how to pursue this kind of information quickly.
We have time for two quick questions. Yes, sir.
This question would be mostly to John Stockwell. In a nutshell, if indeed there is a shadow or a secret government that exists completely under the administrations that just pass over it, and now we find that like a virus, it can actually go into the private sector for its funding, and it can't get it up front. How is that reachable to the common citizens of the U.S. to alter that? To get at it, to dismantle it?
Yeah, his question is, if there is an invisible government and it can reach into private funding for its energy, how can we go at it to stop it? And I would say simply that, this is the struggle to keep our system of government and society working. There are people who are working vigorously to take away our interests, our freedoms, if you will. And it's they try to keep it invisible, but it's not. We can see it, and it's led most recently, figurehead-wise, by President Reagan. Very noisy. It's a struggle. We're raised to be and conditioned to be so naive that we simply cannot comprehend that our country could ever change, that coup d'etats happen, that people would take our freedoms away from us if we let them, and they're trying to do it right now.
Well, say we do comprehend it, we do believe it, then what?
This, of course, is the biggest question of all. What do we do? Where do we go from here? This is what Marc was just raising. What do we do? How much do we value our system of government? We've got some people who are working within and without the system to take away our rights and freedoms. Are you willing to die for them? Are you willing to risk going to jail for them? Are you willing to donate some of your time for them? Are you willing to unplug your television set with a pair of scissors to protect these freedoms? I mean, that's where it gets... Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Last question. Shh. Please. please. Can't hear. Yes?
Does Jesse Jackson's campaign offer some way to break through this racial and cultural differences? And can you comment on the fact that nothing of the lack of information about Jackson has been mentioned?
Well, the question is, does Jesse Jackson's campaign offer an alternative? You know that journalists aren't supposed to make partisan statements. No, I'm joking. Look, I mean, I think that's a personal and individual question. The only thing that I would say to you is that I would answer you indirectly by telling you, not because there's anything wrong with answering you directly, but it's just my opinion.
Well, since Marc cannot answer that directly,
John, I'm going to answer it.
Let's say that Jesse Jackson does offer an alternative.
Well, then I will now I will answer and say that I don't think that Jesse Jackson offers an alternative, because I believe that some candidates are better than others. But I think that the problem that you have with the distribution of power in this country is systemic and has got nothing to do with the individual party or individual that's in power. So now we have a good debate on that. We have to go back into the. If you're interested in the members of Congress who are swing votes,
William J. O'Brien.
they're right up here. Thank you.